Hebrews tells us that the high priests of the Old Testament tabernacle, who could not deal with sin once and for all, were themselves types and symbols consistently pointing to Jesus Christ. He would come as the great high priest who would by himself purge our sins once and forever. He alone would accomplish it, because he alone was qualified to do it. The New Testament book of Hebrews in chapter 9, verse 23 tells us that the Old Covenant tabernacle system consisted of the copies of the things in the heavens, things that still exist and will exist forever. The Old Covenant tabernacle gave us the shadows, but Jesus Christ is the substance. He is the complete and final fulfillment of all that the types and symbols of the Old Testament prophesied. At the beginning of the book of Hebrews, we read this: God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, Jesus Christ, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Hebrews also tells us that the high priests of the Old Testament tabernacle, who could not deal with sin once and for all, were themselves types and symbols consistently pointing to Jesus Christ. He would come as the great high priest who would by himself purge our sins once and forever. He alone would accomplish it, because he alone was qualified to do it. And having completed that work once and for all, Jesus would sit down at the right hand of God the Father. And so Hebrews chapter 4 tells us this: seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but he in all points was tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Hebrews also tells us why Jesus is qualified to be the one true high priest, in distinction from all who came before him. We find this description of Jesus in Hebrews chapter 7. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, or more literally, completely innocent of any transgression, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he did once for all when he offered up himself. And then in Hebrews chapter 8, we read this commentary on the Old Testament record. Now, this is the main point of the things we are saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the Majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary, that is, a minister of the tabernacle sanctuary, and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord erected, and not man. Likewise, in Hebrews chapter 9, we read this: But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place in heaven, once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. In Hebrews chapter 11, we read a great roll call of faith, the faith of the Old Testament saints who only had the types and shadows in their day. But as we read beginning at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And so at the beginning of the next chapter in Hebrews, chapter 12, we find this great exhortation. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher, or more literally, the originator and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. What are the Old Testament tabernacle types and symbols that all point to Jesus? We shall begin to look into them as we continue by first examining the brazen altar on which sacrifices were made for sin.